Today, I want to take a look at 5 potential free agent wide receiver options for the Green Bay Packers. I think when we look at the Packers receiver room with the Christian Watson injury, there is no doubt the Packers need to at least add some kind of receiver. And the question really is, should the Packers spend up on a receiver, one of these big name free agents, or should they go for more of a value type pick? Maybe someone who's not quite as flashy as a signing, but could be enough to give the Packers what they need. And so I want to start off by reading this quote from Brian Gutekunst, Packers GM, at his postseason or the end of the season press conference, because I think it does give us an idea as to how he could be approaching this situation. He said this, quote, "I think we have some of those guys," talking about number one type receivers, "and I think we don't have just one. But I think historically, if you look at a lot of the teams, very rarely do teams that have one receiver that's super heavy with targets that doesn't usually play out well for playoffs and success there." And so just from that, you'd like to assume that Brian Gutekunst isn't out here thinking that for the Packers to take some big step, they need to go find someone who is going to get a massive amount of targets. And I think that if you are to target someone like a Devontae or like a T. Higgins, that's someone who would probably want to go to a place where they are the number one guy, featured guy. And I'm just not sure that Brian Gutekunst is necessarily set on bringing someone in of that caliber. But at the same time, he could switch it up and go after someone like that. So I want to talk about 5 different guys. And here's a mix of guys who I think are more values, cheaper, likely cheaper contracts, and guys who will be on the more expensive end. I'm going to start with this guy. I first saw this idea from, I think it was Zach Cruz on Twitter, but as I was looking through these receivers, this one does make a lot of sense, and that is Marquez Valdes-Scantling, who used to be on the Green Bay Packers from 2018 to 2021. The Packers don't sign him back in, after the 2021 season. He then signs a deal with the Chiefs. He was there from 2022 to 2023. He then goes to the Bills this past offseason. They signed him to a 1-year, $2.5 million deal. They decided to release him when they traded for Amari Cooper, and then he signed a $1.1 million deal with the Saints. And when he went to the Saints, he was a very productive receiver. He finished off 17 receptions, 385 yards, 4 touchdowns, and he finished the year at 3rd in the NFL in yards per reception at 21.6, which is slightly more than Christian Watson, who finished 4th in the NFL at 21.4 yards per reception. And so with Christian Watson and his ACL tear, his dad had shared that if things went smoothly, if it was about the typical time for a guy to return from an ACL tear, he would be back around week 12. And so when Christian Watson went down, the Packers lost that deep threat, the guy who can really stretch the offense and really force opposing defenses to keep an eye on him because he's so fast. And so with him being gone, I think that Marquez Valdes-Scantling could be a perfect fit just because he is that deep threat receiver. He's the guy who, when he was in Green Bay, he didn't do a lot besides catch deep balls. I mean, he can do a little bit more, but that's sort of his strength and I think what teams expect him to do and be. And considering the Packers lost Watson, Valdes-Scantling could be a very cheap option to fill that hole until Christian Watson comes back. And so that's where this could make a lot of sense because the fact that he signed a $1.1 million deal with the Saints, $2.5 million with the Bills, he'd probably be somewhere in that $1 to $4 million range. And so he is probably closer to the end of his career, but he could be a very nice option to fill in for Watson. So that's a very intriguing option in my mind. Now here's another guy, moving to the next guy, who is going to be more expensive. And this is Chris Godwin. He's slated to be a free agent. The Buccaneers could still decide to sign him. If we look at Spotrac, which keeps track of lots of NFL contracts, things like that, he's predicted to cost around $22.5 million per year. Before he went down, he is still one of the more productive receivers in the NFL. He left week 7 with a left ankle dislocation, didn't return. And so I still think he can be a top 10, top 15 type receiver. He's about to be 29 years old, so I don't think he's too old yet, but he is, he's not in his mid-20s anymore. But this is a guy where if you brought him into Green Bay, he can do a lot of different things. He can play in the slot. He can play outside. In his career, he's been more of a slot receiver 55% of the time to 45%, but pretty close. If you look at his first 2 years in the NFL, he was primarily an outside receiver. In 2023, he was at 61% outside. And so considering the Packers already have Jaden Reed in the slot, I think that he could play a lot more on the outside if he did come to Green Bay. And before his injury in 2024, he had 5 straight 1,000-yard seasons. So that's an option where he's going to be a little bit more expensive, but you could get a few years of top-tier production out of him. And so you always do need to be a little cautious with a guy coming off a serious injury, and he is 29 years old. Odds are, in my mind, Gutekunst doesn't sign someone like this. I think he'll go for a cheaper option, in my opinion, based on his comments. But if the Packers decided to spend up, this could be an option that's cheaper than T. Higgins. And now I'll move to T. Higgins, which we have talked about a lot in this channel. He is going to get a lot of money in free agency because there's not a lot of free agent wide receiver options. And there's a chance the Bengals decide to sign him. I don't think they should. I don't think it's smart to pay Jamar Chase, 35 plus million and also pay T. Higgins $28 to $30 million. I think that's too much money to put into your wide receiver room, which is why I think they will move on from him. But he's 6'4", 216. He's a receiver who can really do a lot of different things, great in contested catches situations. He's a very reliable, trusted type receiver. And the fact that he's only 26 years old, any team that signs him is going to get him in his prime years, 26, 27, 28. He's not a guy where you're starting to be concerned. Maybe he's going to reach, the point where he starts to fall off a cliff a little bit. When you start to get to 30 years old, typically that's where you just don't know when different receivers are going to start, not producing quite like they used to. And so with T. Higgins, you know that you're getting him in his prime years. There are concerns with him, injuries. The past 2 years, he's missed 5 games each of the past 2 years, and these have been soft tissue type injuries like hamstring strains, things like that. So that is something to potentially be a little bit cautious about. And I've seen some projections about how much he'll make, and I've seen numbers around $28 million. I think he will make $30 plus million just because 32 teams are going to have a chance to sign him if the Bengals don't decide to pay him. And I would assume that he's going to obviously try to find a team where he thinks they can be competitive, but also really try to make that money on his first massive deal. And so just because there's so many teams who will want his services, I think that could push his price up even more, considering there's no one out there at his age, at his level of talent. So I think that could push him to the mid to $30 plus million. I've seen a few other people say it could be $30 million as well. So that's an expensive option for the Packers. And while I think that adding T. Higgins would benefit this offense, no doubt, I just don't think spending $30 million is necessary. The Packers had the 8th best offense. Do they really need to spend $30 million on a guy? I would rather them not, even though if you told me tomorrow Higgins was on the roster, I'd be excited because I think that is intriguing. So I'm not that opposed to it, but I just don't think Gutekunst is going to do it. That's my thought there. Now we have 2 more receivers. I've gone through 3 so far, and we have one more a little bit expensive guy. And another, I'll start with this guy here. Marquise Brown, Hollywood Brown, who is on the Chiefs currently. He's a very intriguing option, just like Marquez Valdes-Scantling. He's younger than MVS. He's 27 currently. And with him, he was on the Ravens for his first 3 years. Then he goes to the Cardinals for 2 seasons. Then signs with the Chiefs this past year. He was injured most of the season. Now he's been back. And what I like about him is he can really do a lot of different things. He has insane speed, so he can stretch defenses. 4.27 40 speed at Oklahoma's Pro Day back in 2019, so he is insanely fast. He's a shorter receiver, 5'9", so he's not a big guy. And one thing that's interesting when you look at his overall career and his stats, he doesn't average a ton of yards per reception, 11.6 yards per reception, but I don't think that's because he's not a deep threat. It's because he can win in lots of different areas, short, intermediate, and deep. If we look at his deep targets in 2023 in only 14 games, he was 21st in deep targets. Back in 2022 with only 12 games, he was 18th among receivers in deep targets. And so when we think about Christian Watson having that ACL tear, the one thing that you do miss is his speed. And while Marquise Brown is a different type of receiver, nearly 7 inches shorter or so, he still has that speed. And so defenses would have to keep an eye on that, which I do think could open things up for these other Packers receivers. And before this season, he signed with the Chiefs a 1-year, $7 million deal. And so he's not someone that is going to cost as much as a Chris Godwin or a T. Higgins. And so I think that I really feel like Gutekunst would rather go with someone like a Brown or a Marquez Valdes-Scantling just because of the money you're going to be saving. And I honestly think that that's going to be plenty for the Packers. I think they already have a ton of talent. I think Romeo Doubs is a number one receiver. If you give him those targets, I think he would easily have a 1,000-yard season. So I don't think it's a necessity to get a guy, a $20, $30 million receiver. I don't think that's a need for the Packers, that level of guy. Would it help? Sure. But I would rather them spend a little bit less money because I think there are bigger needs like edge rusher where the Packers should really put a lot of their money. And so that's Marquise Brown there. And finally, this one I'm not quite as sold on, but I still think it wouldn't be a terrible idea. That's Stefan Diggs. He's getting older. He's 31 years old. He's coming off an ACL tear. So a lot of reasons to be concerned. But because of those reasons to be concerned, he is going to be cheaper. And so I think that if you look at his contract last year, 1 year, $22.5 million with the Texans, I think now with his age and the ACL tear, I think he could be more in the $10 to $15 million range. I was seeing some other article where they brought up Odell Beckham a few years ago. He suffered an ACL tear, signed a $15 million deal. And so that's something that there's a chance that he comes back and is still a top-tier level receiver. Before he got injured with the Texans in Week 8, he had 47 receptions for 496 yards and 3 touchdowns. And if you got that level of production in 2025 at only $10 to $15 million, that's a massive steal. So this is someone where it is a risk. And considering Watson is coming off an ACL tear, maybe you don't want two of those guys. It's a little risky, but you could end up saving $10 to $20 million when you compare it to Chris Godwin or T. Higgins. And of course, this will be more of a short-term deal. I would see it more as a 1-year deal, likely. And so this could be a guy where you get him for a season, 2 seasons. And so the Packers are just trying to fill a need for the short term. This could work if they want to find a guy who they think they can grow with Jordan Love and they want to spend a lot. T. Higgins would make sense. But I think we'll get more of a cheaper option for the Packers. So those are 5 free agent options. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. If you want more Packers content, feel free to subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.